Now, when it comes to Drake, things have started to unravel after all the lies and all the news. Iceman and the other slop albums Aubrey put out are free-falling on the charts, and honestly, it is getting worse than you could ever imagine. But before we go any further into all of this, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hype up the video. Really make sure to leave that like because it helps me out a ton. And when the Drake fans, and Drake for that matter, are forced to face the reality that their 43-song mega slop album trilogy, which was inherently designed to flood the charts and dominate the algorithm, is already getting outstreamed and outpaced by Kendrick Lamar's 12-song GNX album, they are really not going to like this one. So go ahead and leave a like because we are getting straight into it. And with that, I'm just going to say this. I hope everybody in OVO, all the owl lovers, snack lovers, and whatever else you want to call this fan base, had fun celebrating Drake's first-day numbers from the treacherous trio of Iceman, Habidi, and Native Honor. Because all you were really celebrating was day one hype and hate watchers who tuned in for a laugh and were never planning to return. That is the reality you should face. And honestly, you may have to face it even harder because things are looking very sad right now. When it comes to the Day 2 streaming stats of Iceman and the other albums Drake slopped out, things took an absolutely massive dip. After earning 140 million streams from Iceman, driven by both fans and haters checking out the record, the situation changed quickly. And for the people who, as academics just said, wanted to throw this in everybody's face and celebrate like they had won a championship, I have to ask, are you sure about that? Do you really feel like you won a championship? Because the last time I checked, championships last. They shift culture. They leave a permanent mark. And what are we seeing with Iceman? This thing is melting quickly. By day 2, the album experienced a 50% decrease in streams, dropping from 140 million down to 70 million. And honestly, the irony here is hilarious when you think about Drake talking about Kendrick Lamar on Iceman, referencing claims that Kendrick supposedly lost 100 million streams, even though that never happened and the story was completely fake. Not only did Drake straight up lie, but somehow that became his own reality in less than a day. And remember, this is only day 2 for Iceman. Now, I already know there is somebody upset saying the numbers don't matter. We shouldn't judge music by numbers. You only care about stats when it fits the narrative against Drake. Let me be perfectly clear to Drake, academics, and everybody around OVO. You are the reason this conversation exists. You are the people who listen to music with calculators instead of listening with your ears. And taking it a step further, the reason we need to hold this up in front of all these liars and grifters who tried to rig hip-hop is because while you were sitting there holding calculators and convincing yourselves that you had done it, that you defeated Kendrick Lamar and exposed what you claimed was a fraud, you completely missed reality. In the middle of your parade of delusion, believing you ended the dot era by making music that OVO declared better and undeniably bigger than anything Kendrick had done, I have to ask a very simple question. Are you sure about that? Do you really feel like you won a championship? Because despite GNX being only 12 songs compared to Iceman's 18, do you know what GNX earned on day 2 during tracking? 74 million streams. That is the truth, and there is no escaping it. For the numbers guy, the artist who built his career and helped build an entire culture around listening to music through a calculator rather than embracing art and its nuances, life comes at you quickly. Even after having 2 years to prepare and make sure this never happened again, the reality is that your album is already free-falling. There is no clear hit song dominating streaming. No song is bringing in repeat listeners at the level required to sustain momentum. And that massive decrease is exactly why the numbers are likely to keep going down. But while we're here, I should be fair, because I would be dishonest if I ignored this. Drake actually did break a streaming record today. We have to give props where they're due. He set the record for the biggest single-day streaming drop for a rap song this year, as the intro track to his new album, Make Them Cry, lost a staggering 8 million streams overnight. Now listen, I told you I would give Drake his flowers where they're due. He set a streaming record. But seriously, this is what happens after everything we've seen. Drake, you made this entire album your reclaim to fame and dominance. You openly dissed GNX and what Kendrick Lamar accomplished. You delivered those skip lines on She Bang, along with countless other Kendrick Lamar disses. And after doing all of that, after building so much of this rollout around attacking Kendrick, you now have to watch GNX outstream and outpace the very project you invested your remaining career stock in, while doing it with a fraction of the songs. That matters. And we need to be very clear about the message here. For Drake, what is happening right now is exactly what his name should stand for. Don't rap against Kendrick ever. Do not compete with him, do not try to stomp on his work, and do not try to take over his numbers. Because what this situation is already showing, and what it serves as a reminder of, is this. Big Mac, what championship are you talking about? Because Kendrick is the real king of rap, whether people like it or not. And even just one day into the album cycle, despite Kendrick not chasing numbers, the comparison between GNX and Iceman already tells a story. And I want people to remember something important here. This is Drake's second attempt at this, because SSS for You existed too. Drake tried to position that project as something adjacent to Kendrick's album in the marketplace. But now, looking strictly at GNX versus Iceman and the way both albums are trending, the takeaway becomes obvious. Kendrick is operating at such a high level and at such a high rate that, just like during the beef, we are watching the same story repeat itself. And honestly, this isn't even the first dance. SSS for You failed so badly that people barely remember it on Drake's side. Yet now, for the second time, and with the same album, Kendrick is beating Drake at his own game.
And while GNX saw its numbers increase on day 2 following its shortened 7-hour tracking window, there is a very important reason why that happened. The album was heard. Records like Squabble Up, Luther, and TV Off did exactly what hit songs are supposed to do. They attracted new listeners, pulled in casual audiences, created repeat listens, and established dominant moments through genuine engagement. On the other hand, Drake's album is moving in the opposite direction. The numbers are declining, and at this point it does not look like a single song is positioned to see a major increase. The only possible exception might be the Future collaboration, Ran to Atlanta, which is projected to go #1. But even there, credit has to circle back to Kendrick Lamar, considering Drake is literally interpolating a Not Like Us bar and relying on a moment whose cultural relevance was built around what Kendrick made memorable in the first place. And with the reality now becoming harder to ignore, that Iceman is falling, and even with all of its stat-padding methods cannot compete with GNX, people can take what comes next however they want. But for the fans who love listening to music with calculators, here is another truth. Drake is not only struggling to compete with Kendrick Lamar in the numbers department, he is also failing compared to his own history. That 70 million stream drop-off for Iceman is worse than what we saw with Certified Lover Boy, which experienced a 41% decrease in streams. And surprisingly, For All the Dogs opened with 108 million streams on day 1 before dropping to 75 million on day 2. In terms of retention and decline, even that album ended up outperforming Iceman on its second day. That is honestly wild when you remember that For All the Dogs, in the long run, was largely viewed as a disappointment. I just thought that deserved mentioning for the Drake stans who evaluate music through calculators. And to be clear, this is not even about the quality of those records. But speaking of trajectories, Drake's downward trend becomes even more interesting when compared to the very artist he dedicated so much of his new album toward. At this point, Kendrick Lamar might as well have been listed in the credits. Because when you examine GNX, that 12-song structure matters. The number 12 is important because it takes more listeners to achieve comparable streaming totals with a shorter album. GNX is working with 12 songs compared to Iceman's 18-track runtime, and yet the album maintained extraordinary consistency. You can see how GNX performed during its first week and how it stabilized around the 40 to 50 million stream range after its opening days, despite having a relatively small track list. And once you realize Kendrick delivered the 7th biggest streaming week of all time on Spotify with 363 million streams, competing against Drake's mega-sized 20-plus song releases, the bar becomes very clear. That was not just a strong performance, that was one of the biggest streaming weeks in Spotify history. And there is another fascinating statistic that highlights Kendrick's efficiency. Spotify's top 10 opening week albums ranked by average streams per song. When you look at a list like that, GNX stands out immediately. And while numbers are not everything, since OVO and much of its fan base insist on evaluating music through statistics, let us apply the same rules they created. For years, when Drake struggled to produce records that many people considered genuinely strong, the machine compensated by throwing gigantic numbers onto a screen and encouraging people to accept those figures as proof of superiority. That became the argument. Those numbers became the shield. And now that somebody has finally beaten him within the very framework he depended on, the conversation suddenly becomes uncomfortable. Because Kendrick is not merely winning. The data itself suggests audiences were deeply engaged with GNX. There was little to no meaningful drop-off. Listeners stayed invested. For Drake, we are not seeing the same reality, and the industry knows it. Despite attempts to protect him, soften the narrative, and support the rollout, the cracks are showing. Let us not forget the inflated conversations around Spotify records, the first-day numbers, and the overly ambitious first-week projections. At one point, estimates suggested Iceman could land somewhere in the 500,000 range. Now, even those expectations have shrunk. The projections are sliding into the 400s and possibly toward the lower end of that spectrum. And as the week continues and momentum fades, there's every chance those numbers continue dropping. That shift alone tells you how serious the situation is. When you compare early projections to current reality, it reveals the scale of the disappointment and exposes how even the machine that tried to fall back in love with Drake after investing millions and needing to recoup those investments cannot fully rescue this moment. Even after placing its hand on the scale, the outcome is still slipping away. And this brings us back to the issue of track length. Compare Kendrick Lamar's GNX to Iceman, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Drake effectively attached half another GNX onto Iceman, making it significantly easier to generate inflated streaming totals through volume alone. So even if Iceman debuts somewhere in the 400s, relative to what Kendrick achieved, it's not nearly as impressive as people want to pretend. In fact, if Kendrick had released an album equal in size to Iceman, using the same GNX efficiency and engagement rates, he likely would have crushed Drake outright. We could be talking about numbers in the 500 or even 600 million range. Not that those figures ultimately matter, but people need reminding when they become arrogant about Drake's statistics. This is a man who released an 18-song album against the 12-song project. This is a man who flooded the market with 43 songs on one day, while Kendrick delivered roughly 20 songs across several years. And yet, despite all of that, Kendrick is still winning the statistical battle. But here's the truth. That victory is not even the most important part, because Kendrick Lamar doesn't create music for calculators. He creates music for real people, real minds, real hearts, real emotions, real souls. And maybe that's exactly why GNX demonstrated stronger streaming patterns and more organic growth than Iceman has shown so far. And there's another point worth mentioning. Even in the middle of Drake's latest disses and all the slop thrown into the industry, Kendrick Lamar's GNX has surged back up the charts. It's now back inside the top 10 and showing no signs of slowing down. The album recently passed The Fall Off and Kanye's newest release, which is remarkable considering those projects have been among the year's biggest commercial successes. And still, despite Kendrick continuing to demonstrate strength, we know Drake fans will continue trying to undermine both him and the impact he had on hip-hop. And I understand why. From a fan perspective, your favorite artist lost. Kendrick beat Drake in battle, embarrassed him publicly, and now many fans feel compelled to frame Kendrick as fraudulent or malicious as a way to cope with that outcome. I get it. That reaction makes sense emotionally. But what many people miss by refusing to engage with the other side is understanding why Kendrick succeeds and why audiences gravitate toward him. At least personally, I've tried to put myself in OVO's shoes. Unfortunately, Academic's chair is not very comfortable, and that streaming setup looks terrible. But I've looked at it. I understand why people think the way they do. I understand why Drake still occupies a place as rap's silver medalist. But when it comes to Kendrick Lamar, many fans have completely blocked themselves from understanding why he stands as the gold medalist, the crown bearer, and the leader of this era. And the one thing many people may never fully understand, yet remains central to Kendrick's success and what GNX achieved compared to Iceman, is exactly that difference.
And we have not even gotten to the other albums yet, which, honestly, I do not know if you expected this, but things get even worse. When it comes to Kendrick Lamar, one of the biggest takeaways from his success is that he may be the first artist at the highest level of the industry, at least within this generation, to become as massive as he is while still genuinely respecting his listeners. I know that sounds like a crazy concept, but hear me out. We are talking about an era where Drake dropped 43 songs in a single day. For perspective, Michael Jackson released roughly 150 songs across his entire solo career. People simply do not have the bandwidth to consume endless material from an artist who appears to have no quality control or who comes across as trying to hustle listeners. And that difference is reflected directly in the tracklist sizes, the success numbers, and the overall contrast between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. At this point in both of their careers, this is non-negotiable. There is a glaring disparity between them. And one of the reasons Kendrick has climbed so high is not because he manipulates industry systems, aligns himself with the right people, or plays behind-the-scenes games to push music. People can continue arguing about it, but the truth remains the same. Everything Kendrick does offers high-quality music to his fans and to the world. And beyond that, it is genuinely entertaining. Meanwhile, Drake has developed a reputation for flooding the market with excessive music and hoping something sticks. That is honestly how many people treat Drake releases now, like a grab bag. You listen once, maybe pull one or two songs from the pile, and if that happens, that becomes your annual Drake listening quota. The rest of the material often feels like filler, music that exists primarily to inflate numbers and generate revenue. And that is exactly why things are falling apart. Now, to be fair, Drake's numbers are still larger than most artists in the industry. That is obvious. And when I say things are falling apart, I am not comparing him to artists like Trippie Redd or Kodak. I'm comparing him to the upper tier where he places himself. And at that level, especially within hip-hop and among the artists competing for the throne, Kendrick now exists on an entirely different stratosphere. And if the streaming numbers are somehow still not enough evidence, then wait until tour season. Because if Drake chooses to tour, that will reveal everything. Because Kendrick Lamar is now a stadium artist, and GNX was the project that helped cement that leap. Meanwhile, despite how huge people claim Drake is, he has never done a stadium tour, not even once, and that speaks volumes. Now, while we are discussing the decline of Iceman, the collapsing streams, and the listeners who prioritize numbers over music, this conversation becomes even more significant. Because when it comes to Drake's other projects, Habitat and Maid of Honor, the Day 2 streaming figures paint an even uglier picture. I will say it now and stand by it. At least one of these records is going to finish below 100,000 in sales. Lock that prediction in. And both are likely to finish well below those early projections that floated around the 110K to 130K range. You want to know what these albums did on Day 2? Brace yourself. On the US Spotify charts, Habitat posted 6.8 million streams on Day 2. Yikes. And somehow it gets worse. Maid of Honor performed even lower, reaching 6.6 million streams. And to clarify, just as the 70 million figure for Iceman was global, the worldwide totals for these albums came in around 16 and 15 million respectively. These albums are heading off the charts quickly.
Honestly, within a month, maybe sooner, they could be completely gone unless something drastic changes. And when it comes to Maid of Honor, I don't even want to call it R&B because that would be disrespectful to the genre. It feels like a dance rap crossover record, almost like Honestly Nevermind 2 if that album somehow became exponentially worse. And I genuinely cannot believe I'm about to compliment Honestly Nevermind, but here we are. These projects are cooked. The flop we're witnessing proves the point. The only reason these albums have movement at all is because Drake's name is attached to them. That brings loyal fans trying to convince themselves they enjoy the material because they've already committed to defending him. It also brings hate watchers. And even with both groups involved, the projects still can't sustain decent momentum. These albums are free-falling, and they're turning into complete failures. Not merely compared to rap heavyweights, but even by the standards of ordinary releases from reasonably established artists. Now, there's an argument floating around that Drake dropped these projects to satisfy contractual obligations or execute industry maneuvers. And that may be a convenient explanation now that the numbers are declining. But let's be honest, nobody was saying that when these albums first dropped. Back then, people were celebrating and acting like the GOAT had delivered another legendary statement. Now, suddenly, the releases don't matter. That shift feels more like coping than analysis. And maybe we should simply face reality. Drake clearly wants to be viewed as a triple threat: rapper, singer, and whatever exact lane Maid of Honor is trying to occupy. But when Drake attempts to compete with genuine singers or dominate club music tailored toward DJ-driven trends, the kind associated with collaborators like Gordo, the truth is that he simply isn't particularly strong in those spaces. And that contradiction becomes even harder to ignore considering Iceman. On tracks like Make Them Cry, Drake acknowledges needing maturity and growth. He speaks about age and stepping up. And then immediately afterward, he releases some of the most juvenile material of his career. That disconnect is glaring. To show flashes of self-awareness and then follow it with music like this makes the maturity feel performative, especially on Maid of Honor, where Drake reconnects with figures Kendrick already criticized and delivers songs that feel closer to novelty tracks than meaningful artistic statements. I honestly don't even want to go too deep into certain records. If you don't know what I'm talking about, keep it that way. You don't need that experience. But this is exactly the issue. These awkward club tracks and strange Legend of Zelda-type beat moments completely undermine the direction Drake seemed to suggest with Iceman. And that's contributing heavily to why these albums are failing so aggressively. Now, to be fair, Maid of Honor is not entirely without moments. Tracks like the intro or Road Trips could probably blend into a DJ set and work in the background of that environment. But then there's Cheetah Print. And honestly, that may be the worst song across all three Drake albums, and it's not even close. Again, if you don't know it, stay blessed. But even with that disaster attached to it, if I were rating Maid of Honor on a 5-mic scale, I would probably give it 1. At least it registers. Habitat, however, is another story. That album feels lifeless, boring, dull, and honestly almost unlistenable. It's one of the weakest attempts at music making I've heard in a long time. And even if Iceman were a perfect album, releasing something this week alongside it should absolutely affect Drake's reputation. It feels like he took the saddest elements of SSS for You, stretched them into an entire project, removed originality, and dropped the most derivative version imaginable. And genuinely, I would rate it near 0. Not even because the scale matters, but because it barely feels qualified to sit on one. And when Drake's newest albums make Honestly Nevermind look like off the wall, that tells you how difficult his current position really is. Because Habitat and Maid of Honor have already failed. They're already free-falling, and soon they may be forgotten entirely. Now, regarding Iceman, compared to much of rap this year, it will still post respectable numbers and likely outperform most releases, perhaps aside from projects like Don Toliver's Octane Baby, which has been massive. But compared to Kendrick Lamar and GNX, it's not close, and the numbers are proving it.
And because Drake and his circle built their entire identity around this statistical game, because, as the joke goes, they carry calculators instead of headphones, they may ultimately become the biggest losers of the very competition they demanded, even after all the preparation, even after everything that happened. And with all that said, let me know your thoughts. What do you think about Drake's decline, the comparison to GNX, and what this all means moving forward? And if you made it this far, seriously, thank you for staying with me. It genuinely means a lot. If you haven't already, leave a like, subscribe, hype up the video, and share your thoughts in the comments because I'm excited to hear what you think. And if you want to see how Drake was allegedly caught inflating numbers and why this album cycle may be going downhill even faster than people realize, check out the suggested video. Because honestly, the situation may be even worse than it already looks. Heat.